While y'all were sitting around complaining or wiping the drool off of your chin about Wuthering Heights, I was reading the history article, The 5 Dark Realities That Wuthering Heights Reveals to Us About the Victorian Era. Don't worry, I'm equally as gagged, okay? Spoiler, I'm Team Emerald, by the way. So, if you are just a normal person on the internet who's not involved in all of this absolute drama with Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights, I am going to give you the beautiful background story that the History Channel also thought was necessary to describe the setting that we're in. Emily Bronte published Wuthering Heights in 1847, and when it was published, it was considered very disturbing. The book itself was also set in the 18th century and the Victorian period, and when it was published, they are quoted as saying, "It is a compound of vulgar depravity and unnatural horrors." So what are some of the major social issues of 18th and 19th century England that Wuthering Heights reveals to us? While the movie gave us the opportunity to really dive into the love story, Wuthering Heights actually says a lot about Victorian era child labor, race, class, power, and the abuse of that power through some key social themes. So let's start with the spicy shit, and then we'll work our way down, because I know that some of y'all have the attention span of flies. So I'll start with the good stuff, and then I'll get into the nitty-gritty as we go. So stick around if you want to know what the tea is. Of course, let's start with the elephant in the room. The biggest issue that people have with Emerald Fennell's take on Wuthering Heights is that Heathcliff is white. And one of the biggest themes of Wuthering Heights is racial identity. It is pivotal to the story that Heathcliff's origins remain a mystery. He doesn't have a family. He doesn't have a name. But throughout the book, Heathcliff is often called a common slur for the Romani people. This is incredibly important because the Romani people faced a lot of discrimination in 17th and 18th century England, including but not limited to literal actual statutes that deprived them of their rights. But at the end of the day, Heathcliff is racially and ethnically ambiguous, and we never know for sure, as many different characters call him many different things. As Mr. Linton seems to refer to him as a name at the time that would indicate he was an Indian sailor, or an American or Spanish castaway. And when trying to lift Heathcliff's spirits, at one point, a character tells him, "Oh, well, your father could have been the emperor of China and your mother could have been an Indian queen." So obviously, facially, Heathcliff is very ambiguous. But it is important to note that in the 1700s, Liverpool was a huge slave trading hub. This is important because this is where Earnshaw finds Heathcliff, so it could indicate that Heathcliff has African descent. This ambiguity in race could have been Emily's way of discussing race politics in this time period in England, both with the way that Romani people were treated and with the popularity of the slave trade in Liverpool. Both are kind of lesser known facts about the area at the time that Wuthering Heights really tries to call attention to. Kind of going along with that are the class dynamics, especially with the Earnshaws and Heathcliff. The Earnshaws are land-owning people, which means that they have servants throughout their household. And when they initially bring Heathcliff into the home, he is treated as an equal until he is demoted. This demotion not only affects his financial stability, but also his prospects of ever marrying Cathy. In the end, Cathy has to end up marrying Mr. Linton, which is a huge deal because it exposes class politics at the time, which was the importance of money and marrying for status. This also plays a key part in the revenge plot of Wuthering Heights, in which it takes Heathcliff 3 years to disappear and come back as a gentleman who has somehow made a fortune. In making this fortune, he has greatly changed his life prospects, not only with the ways that he can attain property, but in the ways that he can move through marriages. Which brings us to the abusive marriages in Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff's marriage to Isabella actually helps illustrate how much legal power husbands had over wives in Victorian England. While marrying Isabella and taking her back to Wuthering Heights, which he was able to acquire because of his new status and Hindley's intense gambling debts, but that's another story for another time, he greatly abuses Isabella in more ways ways then we really need to get into, because it's really not about that. But the point being, Isabella actually takes their son and runs away from Wuthering Heights to live out her days on her own. This would have had massive legal repercussions in Victorian England, and there is actually case law that shows us this. Caroline Norton leaves her abusive husband in 1835. In retaliation, the husband George refuses to let Caroline see the children. So Caroline returns to the marriage, only for George to kick her out and again deny her access to her children. This bad bitch petitioned the government to get her children back from her husband, which actually led to the 1839 passing of the Custody of Infants Act, which helped her gain back custody of her children in 1841. So talk about a bad political bitch getting it done, leaving her husband, getting her kids. This was all happening around this time that Wuthering Heights was coming out. So Isabella leaving Heathcliff to raise their son on her own would have been a hot topic that Emily Bronte knew about, as the book would be published 5 years after Caroline got custody of her children. Which leads us to how we treat children in Wuthering Heights, which displays a huge issue with child labor in Victorian England. The character of Heathcliff is brought to Wuthering Heights at about 7 years old, and while he lives with the Earnshaws as an equal for a time, when the patriarch of the family dies, the oldest son, who has been jealous of Heathcliff this whole fucking time, okay, he's like, this guy's stealing my daddy, this is no fun, literally, who is this guy, he's not blood to me, he actually demotes him to a servant at the age of 13. But the fact that he's only 13 is not a shock to Victorian England, where children as young as 5 would have been working in stables and in mines. And in fact, this best friend of Nellie Dean, who is also there, would have been brought into the home as a child, where she had to serve as a plaything and a maid. Child labor in Victorian England was only reduced when the government started to mandate schooling for children in 1880. And even then, it was only that children aged 5 to 10 had to go to school. Over the next 2 decades, they would extend it to children up to the age of 12, but that's still not very old. And at the age of 12, they were free to enter the workforce. But never fear, even if you were a male who was working as a child, there were still prospects for you because of something called coverture. Coverture is a legal concept in which any property that is owned by a woman is owned by her husband. For this reason, women often serve as conduits in Wuthering Heights for property that flows between men but really belongs to women. And the journey of Heathcliff's character illustrates these points perfectly. He goes from being a child servant to leaving the home and being able to find himself a fortune. With this fortune, he's able to acquire Wuthering Heights, and through his marriage to Isabella and creating heirs, he's also able to acquire the neighboring home of Thrushcross Grange. Basically, he makes Kathy's daughter, Kathy Jr., marry his son, Linton, so that when everything is said and done, who acquires Thrushcross Grange but Heathcliff? So when Kathy Jr.'s daddy dies, which happens not that long after the union, guess who gets the estate? Him. So Wuthering Heights is doing a lot of work behind the scenes to expose a lot of things that would have been on Emily Bronte's radar during Victorian England. And while you managed to sit through an almost 10-minute video talking about them, it probably would have been incredibly painful and at times very dull and boring to sit through it in a movie, which is probably why adaptations of Wuthering Heights have not been able to comprehensively capture all of these topics. So while I think it's important to talk about them and capture a lot of love for what Emily was able to do with Wuthering Heights, I also think that Emerald Fennell is a fucking genius, okay? I'm not going to sit here and lie to you. I thought that was a blast and a half. I've already seen it twice. And I'll see it again. Bye-bye.